True Crime. I'm Manny Rodriguez. In today's episode, I want to cover the February 9th serial killer. Man who was unidentified for a very long time until they finally caught him. How do you suppose they caught up with him? Well, let's go ahead and dive into it and find out what we know. The February 9th killer, for the longest time, was considered an unidentified suspected murderer that was believed to be responsible for the 2006 murder of Sonia Mejia and her unborn baby, and the 2008 murder of Damiana Castillo in Salt Lake County, Utah. The murders were committed on the same day, February 9th, which is how the name came about. Not the same day, same year, same day, different years, which of course adds to this. Like, is it expected that every February 9th this is going to happen? And so on February 9th, 2006, at 5:58 p.m., officers were called to 1167 West Clubhouse Drive in Salt Lake County on a report of a deceased female. Now, upon entering the apartment, officers observed Cheetos spilled over the entryway, both inside and outside the front door. Now, just inside the door, officers located a bag of Cheetos and a Coke bottle. Now, this is not the norm in that household, as we will find out. But officers located the body of Sonia Mejia in the bedroom. Miss Mejia had a ligature around her neck. She was 6 months pregnant, and the developing fetus died in the womb. She was found by her husband, Mr. P. Cardenas, when he returned home from work. He's the one that called 911. And he stated that the following items were missing: her keys, her vehicle, a heart-shaped ring, a diamond ring, and a religious pendant. Now, Mr. Cardenas, he stated that no one residing in the apartment drank any Coke and that Cheetos are not regularly kept in the apartment. Then we find out that a neighbor actually saw something himself. You see, Mr. N. Torres, he stated that at 11:30 a.m. on February 9th, 2006, he observed a Hispanic male leaning against the door frame to Miss Mejia's apartment. She was just standing just inside the door, speaking with the male. And Mr. Torres stated that the male grabbed Miss Mejia by her throat and hit her on the side of the head. She fell to the floor inside of the apartment. The male enters the apartment and kicks the door shut. That's what Mr. Torres had reported. Now, how soon after that Mr. Torres reported that? We don't know if he thought it was a domestic abuse and he didn't say anything. We don't know much on that particular aspect. But we do have a report that someone did see this man standing outside of the door. Now, on February 10th, 2006, Dr. Elias, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner at the time with the Utah Office of the Medical Examiner, he performed an autopsy on Sonia Mejia. And he determined that Miss Mejia's cause of death to be ligature strangulation and the manner of death to be homicide. And he estimated that the age of the fetus to be 24 to 25 weeks. And he determined that the cause of death to the fetus was maternal demise. And he did rule the manner of death to be homicide. Okay, so that's the first two victims. Now, latent prints were obtained from that Cheetos bag and the Coke bottle. Now, what you see on your screen is for demonstration purposes only. This is not the actual product or whatever. But the prints were obtained from the Cheetos bag and the Coke bottle. And so what do after they obtained the prints? Of course, it's entered into automated fingerprint identification system so that at any time they can hopefully find a suspect. And a DNA profile was obtained from the ligature around Miss Mejia's neck and the Coke bottle. Now, the DNA profile that was entered into the combined DNA index system known as CODIS. An original John Doe information and warrant of arrest based upon the DNA profile was filed on February 8th, 2010. 4 years after the original murder, after the first one of Sonia Mejia. Rest in peace, Sonia Mejia, taken from this world way too soon. The second victim, she did not fit the same profile, but her proximity and the date of her murder being February 9th gave police reason to connect the two unsolved cases. You see, on February 9th, 2008, 2 years after the first one, Isaias Gomez tried calling his mother, Castillo, several times. She was expecting him to pick her up for work that day. And so he couldn't get a hold of her. Eventually, he decides to drop by, but his mom didn't come to the door. He lets himself in after finding a spare key outside. And he finds his mother lying on the living room floor, partially covered with a pillow. He tells ABC4 News the apartment was a mess. Right away, he calls police when he sees this. Police, they gather DNA evidence from the scene. On February 10th, 2008, that's when officers were called to the 4000 South Redwood Road in Salt Lake County on a report of a deceased female, which is that phone call from her son. And that's where officers located the body of Damiana Castillo just inside the front door. Miss Castillo, she had ligature around her neck. A small table near the door was overturned, indicating that there was a struggle that occurred right at the front door. Now, if you remember the neighbor of the first one, a man at the front door breaks his way in, grabs the lady by the neck. So I'm not too sure why this wasn't automatically tied and they waited for the distance between the two, but it definitely looks like this was tied to this. And that's when that small table near the door was overturned, meaning that there was a struggle right at the front door. And the contents of Miss Castillo's purse, including her wallet, had been dumped out onto the couch, and Miss Castillo's jewelry boxes had been disturbed, like ransacked through it. Again, just like the first murder where the jewelry was stolen. And on February 11, 2008, Dr. R. Robert Dieters, assistant medical examiner with the Utah office of the medical examiner, performed an autopsy on Damiana Castillo. And he determined that Miss Castillo's cause of death to be asphyxiation due to strangulation by ligature, and the manner of death to be homicide, very similar to the first death. A latent print was also obtained from Miss Castillo's wallet. Rest in peace to Damiana Castillo, taken from this world way too soon. So that fingerprint was entered into the automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS. And so, of course, a DNA profile was obtained from that ligature around Miss Castillo's neck. The DNA profile, it's consistent with the DNA profile obtained from the ligature around Miss Mejia's neck and the Coke bottle from Miss Mejia's apartment. Then, in 2016, AFIS reported a match of the latent fingerprints that were obtained from each of the scenes at Miss Mejia's and Miss Castillo's homicides, and then we find an identification. Juan Antonio Areola Murillo. That who these fingerprints led to. And so the collected Latin prints, they were manually compared to the 10 print record for Juan Antonio. And the Latin print from the Cheetos bag at Miss Mejia's apartment was identified as, again, Juan Antonio. And this was his right index finger that was identified on the Cheetos bag, and the print from the Coke bottle was identified as his right thumb, and the print from Miss Castillo's wallet was identified as his right middle finger. Now, Juan Antonio, he was deported to Mexico in October of 2008. And so at this time, he had no clue because they weren't on to him just yet. Right? They had fingerprints, but they didn't have him identified yet. On January 7th of 2022, Juan Antonio Areola Murillo was apprehended and booked in a Salt Lake County jail after having been extradited from Mexico. There, he was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, aggravated burglary. The 42-year-old man will likely spend the rest of his life in prison after admitting to killing 2 women and an unborn child in a series of slaying, again, dating back more than 15 years. He did formally plead guilty in Utah to 3 first-degree felony counts of aggravated murder in the 2006 killings of 29-year-old Sonia Mejia and her unborn daughter, as well as the 2008 death of 57-year-old Damiana Castillo. The murders, again, took place on the same date of February 9th, exactly 2 years apart. We truly do believe that he will spend the rest of his life in prison, but he won't face sentencing until August 10th. Now, according to a press release from the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office, Juan Antonio was in the U.S. illegally. Then he was deported back to Mexico by authorities 8 months after Castillo was killed, but before he was identified as a suspect in her murder. It wasn't until 2016 that investigators were able to match fingerprints recovered from both of the crime scenes with Areola Murillo. He was charged with all 3 counts of murder the following year, but he wasn't able to face those charges in the U.S. at the time. He had been convicted in Mexico for another series of aggravated robberies, and so he was serving his time there in the Mexican prison. Then, in January of 2022, after he completed his sentencing, he was released from detention, then extradited back to Utah to face the murder charges. Now, that's why we know he will not be facing the death penalty, and I'll explain here in a second. But District Attorney Sim Gill, he said in a statement after the plea hearing, "Our office mourns the losses of Damiana Castillo, Sonia Mejia, and her unborn child. While perfect justice would mean that these 3 individuals would still be with us today, we hope that these guilty pleas can bring a semblance of justice and closure for these families. We would like to acknowledge Unified Police Department, West Valley City Police Department, and our prosecutors for their efforts on this case. We would like to also thank our partner agency on extraditing Mr. Areola Murillo back to Utah to account for his crimes." Now, he had previously explained that Juan Antonio will face life in prison, not the death penalty, due to a diplomatic restrictions on defendants that are extradited from Mexico to the U.S. So, in other words, the Mexican government only extradites individuals after being assured that the person that's being extradited back to the States will not be put to death. And in this case, since they agreed to it, they will not be putting him to death. Rest in peace to these young women taken from this world way too soon. My friends, it's reasons like this as to why we have to keep these stories in front. You never know. You never know. 2006 was a different time, but it was still a dangerous time. But now, maybe things like that are what causes people to be so on high alert if someone rings their doorbell. If you follow true crime, you know that there's a lot of stories that are going out about someone pulling into a driveway, getting shot, knocking on the door, getting shot, playing hide and go seek, getting shot. A kid. So this is why we have to be alert of what could go wrong in this crazy world we live in. This is not about me. This is about being a voice for these victims who were taken from this world way too soon. Until next time, my friends, be safe, be alert, be careful. Rest in peace to the 3 individuals and one who didn't even get to start their world. Rest in peace. Till next time, my friends, peace.